We are thrilled to have Masha Gessen back. I think she's been at Politics and Prose for at least your last two books, and we always want to grab her when we can. Of course, she's going to be talking tonight about her new book. It's called The Brothers, and I'm sure you know that refers to Tamerlan and Jahar. I can say Jahar because that was what he ended up calling himself, which she talks about in the book. Tsarnaev, the two brothers who were responsible for the Boston Marathon bombings. Those of you who don't know Masha may not realize that she is a person who is often turned to for the unvarnished and honest and courageous truth about a very volatile and important part of the world, that being Russia and its surroundings. She herself was born in Russia. She came to the Boston area as a teenager. That would have been about a generation before the Tsarnaevs, but in her case, she was fleeing not war, but the persecution experienced by Soviet Jews. She's also well-versed in the profound violence of the region. She's returned to Russia in her 20s to work there as a journalist. She covered the wars in Chechnya firsthand. And then in terms of the reporting on this book, and if you haven't read it yet, and hopefully you will, you'll realize very quickly the incredible amount of reporting that went into it, and just prodigiously reported. And I have to suspect that being accustomed to the harsh winters in Moscow, you were better than most of your fellow reporters at braving the punishing Boston winters and covering the trial firsthand. And I actually have heard through a very reliable source and mutual friend that Masha relied on her trusty folding bicycle to get around Boston when the transit system there broke down during this past winter, and she was even able to track down, I guess, on your bikes, a very elusive source. So that took a lot of gumption and nerve, which I think probably is part of the DNA in you because of where you're normally reporting. So I always think of Masha as being as courageous as she is eloquent. She's been an unrelenting thorn in the side of the Russian authorities, particularly Vladimir Putin, an ongoing advocate for democracy and LGBT rights. She's written, is this your 8th book? Seventh book? 7 books. She's a contributor to the New York Times, Vanity Fair, The New Republic, Slate. I think many of you may have seen her on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and she is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. What's amazing about this book is that it's really different from the many other books that have been written about these bombings, in that it really focuses extremely little attention on the crime itself, but rather attempts to explain the forces and personalities and conditions that conspired and collided in the years leading up to the bombing. A Boston Globe review summed up the brothers this way, quote, "Many books about the bombing have been published, but none have gone as far to place the brothers in a global historical context. Her tenacious reporting commands our attention and makes the brothers essential to understanding how the heartbreak here in Boston fits into the endless heartache of this world." And I can't think of a better way of describing this book. I really urge you all to read it. And by the way, if you have not read her previous books and you have any remote interest in Russia and its history and its current context, those two are must-reading and brilliantly done. As you'll see, she is both courageous and eloquent. So thank you for being with us.
Wow, this is great. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to try to live up to it. I don't know if I'll manage. But the first thing I want to lay to rest is the idea that anything, including growing up in Russia, could have prepared anybody for spending this past winter in Boston. It was like nothing I had ever experienced. It did sort of help me in tracking down the source, because there was this person that I had been chasing for months and months, actually for almost 2 years, and she would correspond with me, but she wouldn't meet with me. And I found an Airbnb across the street from her house. And I was going to stay there, and then the first warning, we didn't realize that back then, I mean, if we knew then what we know now, that the first snowfall to end all snowfalls would just be the first snowfall to end all snowfalls, in an unremitting series of 2 months of snowfalls. But just before that snowfall, I thought, well, obviously there's not going to be any court tomorrow, and there's kind of no point in going, but I could go into that Airbnb and get myself snowed in. And she would be snowed in across the street. And so I went to Penn Station, and the announcement was, I quote, "This is the last train to Boston until further notice." And I got on the train, went to Boston, had to ride my bike because the subway wasn't working, and went to sleep in the Airbnb, and I woke up in the morning, and where the glass door had been, there was a big snowbank. And so I emailed the source, who wouldn't meet with me for a year, "Do you need help shoveling? Because I love to shovel, and I'm across the street." And so she wrote, "No, I don't need help shoveling, but you can come over." And so I went over and met her. And I'm going on at length about the winter because that's actually the part I'm going to read. It's from I'm actually going to read the very end of the book. It's the epilogue, and as Lisa said, the first half of the book is really the story of the family. The second half of the book is the story of the investigation. But the wonderful book critic David Ulin wrote in his review in the LA Times that this is a book about what we've become. And this is the part I want to read from the epilogue because I think it is about what we've become. And it begins with the snow. So the book was supposed to come out, it was supposed to come out when it came out in April, but I was supposed to write the epilogue about the trial because we didn't realize that there was going to be 105 inches of snow and the trial was going to keep getting pushed back. So I ended up writing the epilogue the day before opening arguments because they couldn't delay the printing any longer. Fortunately for the book and unfortunately for the rest of us, no real new information emerged from the trial, so the book isn't outdated. But while I was in Boston for 5 weeks watching jury selection and taking many, many snow days, I was also sort of trying to think about what this book was about. So as the weeks wore on and the snow piled up, the number of reporters in the press room dwindled. The room reserved for members of the public who wanted to watch jury selection through a video uplink was often deserted. One day, a young Latino man with a close-cropped beard and equally short hair on his head was the only person there. His name was Luis Vasquez. Luis's wife had woken him on the Friday morning after the bombing. The bombing was on a Monday afternoon, and there were no suspects known to the public until Thursday. On Thursday, pictures of the bombers had been released, and on Thursday night there was a shootout, gunfight in Watertown, a suburb of Boston, and at the end of that gunfight, Tamerlan Tsarnaev was dead, and Jahar Tsarnaev was on the loose on Friday. So she woke him up on the Friday morning after the bombing. She shook him, that is, until he was awake. Then she tried to say something, but words refused to form. She pointed at the television and said, "Look at the names." There were the same pictures the couple had seen on the screen the evening before, but now the suspects were identified. Luis had not recognized Tamerlan earlier because, frankly, the guy on television didn't look like Tamerlan. Quote, "The Tamerlan I knew never wore a hat. His hair was far too good for that. He never wore sunglasses. Girls loved his eyes. He was never clean-shaven. He always had a 5 o'clock shadow going unless he had to shave for boxing. He was never stooped. The Tamerlan I knew was tall. He stood proud. He was a beautiful man." End quote. The man in the photos looked ordinary, even dumpy. Tamerlan and Luis had always been the opposite of that. They had become friends at Ridge and Latin, which is the high school that the boys went to, because they both shadowed a tight-knit group of ESL girls. Tamerlan was keeping watch over Bella, his younger sister, and Luis was trailing his girlfriend, Bella's best friend, who was Venezuelan. Now this girl, who had become Luis's wife, was pointing at the television set while Louis, quote, felt like I was floating, like I was pulled out of my own body. Then CNN called, and Louis became a star of its Boston bombing show. He did not know much. He realized how little Tamerlan had disclosed whenever they had run into each other in the years after graduating from high school. But compared with people who had been talking into microphones before him, Louis was an expert. He debunked the theory that the brothers, quote, had been brought up to be terrorists, unquote, as he had already heard it put on the air. He stressed that they had been living in Cambridge for a decade. He mentioned that he had often seen Tamerlan in the library studying. After high school, their paths had been fairly similar. Both got married, both became fathers. Louis's first son was born when he was 19. Louis had dropped out of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, as well as Bunker Hill. And Tamerlan had dropped out of Bunker Hill Community College. Both of them had been staring at hard and hopeless lives as working-class young fathers in an overpriced American city where they had been led to believe they could lead lives of meaning. About a month before the bombing, Louis had announced his candidacy for the Cambridge City Council, the longest shot on a long list. And now he was on national television. He looked great. Strangers on Twitter began tagging CNN with calls for the network to hire him as an on-air personality. When it was all over, Louis applied to the competitive journalism department at Emerson College, and with an over-the-top recommendation from CNN, he was admitted. He still lost his city council race. The college was not far from the courthouse, so Louis discovered the peculiar pleasure of spending some of his afternoons watching the interminable process of jury selection. The week I met with Louis, a federal appeals court had heard the defense argue, as it had repeatedly in written motions, that the trial should be moved from Boston. Between the saturation publicity and what she called the 6 degrees of connection, argued Judith Misner, the public defender's appellate chief, justice in Massachusetts could not have the necessary, quote, appearance of justice, end quote. It was not a large state, and the Boston Marathon was a very large event in it. One after another, potential jurors had said that they knew someone on the witness list, or someone who had been at the finish line, or a first responder, or they worked for a company that sponsored the marathon, or a hospital that treated some of the victims. As if to underscore the effects of saturation publicity, one of the judges had asked a prosecutor about, quote, the video of the defendant placing a backpack at the site of the explosion, end quote. This was a video that, if it existed, had never been shown to the public. Sorry. A fact that the prosecutor failed to point out. The following day, one of the prospective jurors also made reference to having seen this purported video. To my surprise, Louis, who seemed to have perfected the political art of speaking with detachment about anything, waxed passionate about moving the trial. Quote, it's an attempt to strip us of our dignity all over again, he said. If someone has the audacity to hurt our community, they should have the cojones to face us back and to explain, end quote. Did he really think he would get an explanation from Jahar, who was not likely even to testify at his own trial? Louis admitted that he did not. After a few minutes, we circled back to April 2013. The afternoon of the marathon, Louis had been planning to go to the finish line with his family. He had not much wanted to, so they had been slow leaving the apartment. Louis had stepped back in to turn off the television, and on it had seen the explosions. I expected him to say that if he had been less reluctant to attend the marathon, he or any other member of his family might have died. But instead he said, quote, if I'd made it to the finish line, he would have seen me with my family. Would he have stopped? I just keep thinking of that small, tiny chance that the whole thing could have been prevented just by being there, end quote. On Friday evening, 4 days after the bombing, Louis was standing at CNN's temporary set in Boston's Copley Square talking with Anderson Cooper. He heard a producer say that the younger brother had just been captured, and he thought, they're going to drop me now. Then he heard Anderson Cooper say that Jahar was in custody, and Louis was still there, at the very center of things, on the news. The crowd around them began chanting, USA, USA. What Louis really wanted to say was, we got him, I'm going to Disney World. He felt that much the winner at the moment. He might have failed 4 days earlier to prevent a tragedy by his mere presence. But now, by his mere presence, He had become intimately involved with bringing evil to justice. He did not give voice to any of that, but instead, with suitable grandeur, he did what Anderson Cooper had not done. He made a sweeping motion to include the chanting crowd in the shot. This might have been what he had anticipated that morning when he felt himself floating, like he had been pulled out of his body, his own moment of glory. And this was not only his moment of glory, but in the fervor of all those chanting people, the glory of his time, his place, his country, the vastness of all that it stood for against the vastness of all that threatened it. Quote, "The one thing I hold dear and I cherish," Lewis told me on a frozen afternoon in Boston nearly 2 years later, "is the chants USA flooding the airwaves, and I forever got to be a part of that moment." End quote. No wonder he didn't want to let it go. That's it. That was the end of the book. Should I take questions now?
So if you have a question, I can pass a mic to you so that everybody can hear you. I'm sure somebody must, and if not, I'm happy to jump in, but I don't want to discourage you. Questions? Yes, ma'am. Here you go.
Do you think the bombing would have been more politicized if it had occurred at the modern time point when the US and Russia are in a dispute over Ukraine than it was at that point in time?
I can't imagine how it would have been more politicized. I mean, they didn't claim to represent Russia. And one of the things that I actually talk about in the book is what has happened, what happened in Russia after 9/11. Because basically after 9/11, Putin got to reframe the ongoing war in Chechnya and the other violence in the North Caucasus as part of the war on terror, which it obviously didn't start out as, and I would argue still isn't. But basically the US stopped criticizing Russia for the war in Chechnya and in the North Caucasus. Russia got to get some of its, some of the most prominent Chechen insurgents listed as international terrorists. It became much more difficult to come here to this country as a refugee from Chechnya because of the material support clause that basically says that anybody who has given material support to organizations that the US now, post 9/11, considers terrorist organizations as part of its cooperation with Russia, then anyone who's given material support is not eligible for asylum in this country or for permanent residence. And that's had a devastating effect on people fleeing actual war in Chechnya. So I think those are the sort of the important consequences of US-Russian relations in this context. And the other thing, of course, about this story is that I think that the FBI is fully aware of the fiction that its cooperation with Russia in the war on terror is. Part of the reason that this story played out the way it did was when the Russian secret services informed the FBI of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's existence and flagged him as a terrorism risk. The FBI knew from the get-go that that was bad information, because it's always bad information. We can talk about how that all unraveled. But anyway, so I don't see how Ukraine would have played into it. But there's an obvious dimension to the story that has to do with Russian-U.S. relations.
Hi. I heard you on the radio today, and I thought it was really great what you said.
Thank you.
And the main thing I picked up was you were talking about the way that immigrants, the hard time that immigrants have coming into this country. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that. They're really evidently just sort of left on their own. That's it. You're here.
I'm sorry, say that again?
It seems like they come in and it's like, "Hey, all right, you're here now. It's up to you to do whatever. There's no real help offered. It seems.
Yeah, so I actually, as Lisa mentioned, I came here in 1981 as a refugee. And that was a really luxurious way to come to this country. Nobody comes here as a refugee anymore, or virtually nobody. But we qualified for public assistance, and we got all sorts of help from the Jewish communities here. That is a very atypical story. Most people who come here as de facto political refugees come here on tourist visas and then ask for political asylum. While people are here as tourists or as asylum seekers, before they get status, and this can last a year or 2 or 3 or 5, they are nobodies. And they're particularly nobodies since the 1990s, when the Clinton administration changed some of the regulations having to do with asylum seekers to basically discourage people from freeloading while seeking asylum. So asylum seekers no longer get any public assistance. That's obviously just one aspect of the difficulty of being an immigrant. And even if you come in as cushy situation as I did, you become extremely aware, even as a teenager, which I was, of just how precarious your existence is when you're yanked out of your usual social networks, when you no longer have a safety net. And what this played out in the Tsarnaev story in really tragic ways. They had spent their entire lives basically zigzagging around the former Soviet Union looking for home. They finally came to the US. They had great American dreams, and they had every intention of making good on them and giving their children an education. And they really tried. And I think that probably the hardest chapter to take in the book is the one about the unraveling of this family over the decade that they lived in the US, and sort of all the ways in which they didn't catch a break. They had this idea that Tamerlan, the oldest brother, was going to become an Olympic boxer, and it wasn't a crazy idea. He was a very talented boxer. As soon as he started competing in the amateur association here in Golden Gloves, he started winning competitions. And then Golden Gloves decided that non-citizens could no longer compete in the nationals. And so he couldn't try out for the Olympic team. So that was one dream down. The mother worked very hard. She got her beautician certificate. She went to work for the first time in her life. She worked at a beauty salon starting right after graduation. And then the financial crisis of 2008 happened, and the salon went belly up, and she was out of work. The father never figured out a way to learn English or to get to do anything other than fix clunkers in the street. They walked a really fine line between sort of getting their sons to assimilate, getting their daughters to be obedient and to not act American. They married them off young. Both of them had violent marriages. They left their husbands with their children and ended up at home. And so one after another, these things just didn't work, and small things trip people up in big ways when they have no safety net.
Thank you. I would like to thank you for your courage in your journalism. I know that it's very difficult, and the threats against journalists and the freedom that they fight for is real. And so I would like to first thank you for that. And I have 2 questions. First, I would like you to expand upon your comments regarding the FBI, which you just referred to. But then also, after having read your book, the part that was most curious to me was actually the last paragraph before the epilogue, which has to do with Jahar and his brother Tamerlan actually saying, declaring war on a great power. And I wanted to ask if you could please expand upon how you understand their thoughts to be fighting against a great power. What evidence is there that that was what they were thinking, or how did you uncover that thread of the story? Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the thank you. but I think, the people who are still, I left Russia a year and a half ago, and things got a lot less nerve-wracking after that, and the people who are in real danger are the people who are there full-time now. But, so let's see, the first question was the FBI. It's kind of a long story, and part of it is in the book, but basically what we know about what happened in 2011 is that the FBI got a flag from the Russian intelligence service that there was somebody named Tsarnaev living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, whom they believed to have been radicalized. What I think happened was that the parents applied for their Russian passports, and in those application forms they had to list any adult relatives living abroad. Because there's this cooperation agreement between the FSB and the FBI, and the FSB really and truly believes that any young urban Muslim is a terrorist. So having learned of the existence of yet another young urban Muslim living in the United States, they let the FBI know. The FBI took that information for exactly what it's worth, but sent out a field agent to speak to Tamerlan Tsarnaev at least 3 times in the spring of 2011. There's a reason the FBI does that, and it's not a bad reason. Someone like Tamerlan Tsarnaev is a prime candidate to be recruited as an FBI informant because he's bilingual, he is an integrated member of the immigrant community, but not an integrated member of the Muslim community in Boston. That's exactly the kind of person that the FBI goes for, and again, I would say with good reason. Those kinds of people are recruitable and usable. And we do know that during at least one of the 3 interviews, the FBI did try to recruit Tamerlan Tsarnaev as an informant. And then we don't know what happened. Whether they thought he was working for them, whether he thought he was leading them on. But somehow, less than 2 years later, he was able to build bombs in what should have been plain sight of the FBI and set them off in the biggest public gathering in Boston, creating the biggest terrorist attack on U.S. soil, Muslim terrorist attack on U.S. soil since 9/11. So that's the short story of what went terribly wrong. I also talk in that chapter about the fact that most of the terrorist investigations of the last 14 years have resulted from FBI entrapment schemes. All of them have involved informants, and this may be an informant relationship gone terribly wrong. Now, of course, we should know at this point whether that's what happened. But in order for that kind of information to emerge, a civilian oversight agency would have to call the FBI to account. There was a congressional report on the Boston bombing. It was basically laughable. It was the result of a 3-day mission to Russia by several congressmen who spent their time traveling with Steven Seagal, who's a washed-up action star who now works as a PR flag for the Chechen government. And they released a report that contained less information than at that point was publicly available in the media in this country, but did contain some complaints about the FBI's failure to cooperate in the investigation. That's all we know, and that's all we're going to know until somebody calls the FBI to account. And finally, to answer your second question, so what I talk about in that last bit is the lure of terrorism. And I think that the lure of terrorism, and this is something that we rarely think about and certainly never talk about, is that it's a sort of a shortcut to becoming somebody. It's a chance to become part of something great. For somebody who feels like a nobody, and nobody feels more like a nobody than an immigrant does, and suddenly you can become part of this imagined community of international terrorism, but you can also become somebody because you get to declare war on a great power. And the thing about the war on terror is that your declaration of war is accepted. You're not treated, as I argue you should be, as a common criminal, as someone who's committed a heinous murder, which is what they did, but you're treated as an enemy combatant. Not necessarily in the legal sense, although I would argue that in some ways in the legal sense as well, but certainly in the media sense, in the public sense. And that was very much the rhetoric during Jahar Tsarnaev's trial. We were attacked. He attacked us. That's the way we talk about it. That's the way the law talks about it.
I had just, right before the bombing, I just finished Patrick Morrow's book, Constellation of Vital Phenomena. And that connected to me, once I heard about the bombing and heard about who had done it, connected to Richard Wright's book, Native Son, and to the E.L. Doctorow book, Ragtime. People that have just ingested so much anger and horror and anguish that it drives them crazy, or it just drives them to a blind rage, and they just want to kill people. And I'm wondering if that's what your sense is.
I like your literary associations. So the Constellation of Vital Phenomena, that's interesting. It's actually based on the life story in a book by somebody who is in the book, a real Chechen doctor who wrote a book called Grief of My Heart, and who actually hosted the Tsarnaevs when they first came to Boston. So it's a very small world, and Hassan Bayev, he's now living back in Russia, working as a plastic surgeon, making a very good living. Anyway, I think this is really shaky ground, because on the one hand, I'm obviously not trying to say that what they did is justifiable or even determined. I am, however, trying to say that it is in some ways explainable. And that's one of the Washington Post reviewers accused, no, it wasn't a Washington Post reviewer, it was someone else, but anyway, someone accused me of having too much empathy, which I thought was interesting and an intriguing concept, but one that definitely doesn't describe me. But I think, there are obviously hundreds of thousands of people who have experienced similar hardship or comparable hardship. There are hundreds of thousands of people in Chechnya alone whose life stories are remarkably similar to the Tsarnaevs, and in some ways are less happy than the Tsarnaevs, who never did make it out to the United States. And most of them will never go and build a bomb. So in that sense, I want to draw the distinction that this is useful to understanding these particular people, I think. But I by no means want to say that this is a predetermined outcome. Most people who have been abused and victimized and marginalized and disenfranchised do not resort to violence. In fact, most people who draw conclusions from those things that lead to radical beliefs will still never resort to violence.
Thank you. My question does not relate to this book particularly. And I too have to thank you for being such a terrific resource to me. I've had the privilege of working somewhat in Russia since 1994, and probably having been there 30, 35 times between 1994 and recently. And so much has changed during that period, and your insights have always helped explicate for me often a very confusing terrain. I'm interested in your perception of where Russian people are today, understanding there's no such thing as a monolithic Russian person. But I have seen such change in attitudes over these 25 years, most of my work was around advocacy and promoting women's agendas, and there were many courageous women throughout the country, whether we were talking about Novichokossk or Siberia or St. Petersburg or Moscow. My last trip was in July of last year, and so much has changed, and people's thinking has changed. And I think the rhetoric on America's side and on Russia's side has really catapulted people to such extremes that I wonder what you think is possible in terms of a Russia today that will ever be able to both reconcile some kind of a detente between the United States and Russia, and also a sense of independence from a Putin-esque view of the world.
Well, I happen to be writing a book about that right now, but to make a long story short, what I think is happening, and in a way, I actually think it's reasonable to talk about the Russian people as a monolith right now,
Yeah.
as it was reasonable during the Soviet era, not because there was no difference, but because it was a totalitarian country, and a totalitarian regime, as Hannah Arendt wrote, robs people of their difference and creates what she called one man of gigantic proportions. And I think the scariest thing that we have seen in the last 3 years is the retrofitting of those totalitarian mechanisms and setting them back into motion. It's like this car that has been sitting on blocks for 25 years, and suddenly they put wheels on it and it started rolling. And it moves exactly the way it did before the Soviet Union collapsed. And you see that in the polling numbers. That's one of the most disturbing indicators. And suddenly you see 86, 88% figures, 86% Putin popularity, 88% support the war in Ukraine. When you see those kinds of numbers, you realize that you're no longer measuring public opinion as you would in a country where there's public opinion and it can be measured, right? What you're measuring is the state of society itself, and it's reverted to a totalitarian state. And unfortunately, that doesn't mean that people are lying. It means that people have gone back into a state where they viscerally understand that it is a matter of survival to sort of intuit the party line and be able to repeat it when necessary. And it's not insincere. It's not that they're like hiding their true beliefs. It's that they've gone into that state of dread that necessitates that kind of behavior. That bodes very poorly for the future. I have a hard time trying to figure out where to find hope. I think the only hope at this point, I've really been trying to do this mental exercise. What could I pin any hope on, right? So I finally figured that, okay, I have some hope for those parts of Russia that will split off in the inevitable redrawing of borders that will follow the implosion of the current system. They might have a chance. That's.
Wow. How about the economy? Will the economy, how that ebbs and flows, will that make any difference, do you think?
What do you mean?
Well, we hear in the United States that the economy of Russia is not going to stay stable. I don't know if that's true.
No, the economy of Russia is not stable. It's in a drastic slowdown. The ruble has lost 2/3 of its value over the last year and 3 months. Part of that is because of the drop in oil prices. Part of it is due to economic sanctions. Part of it is the result of the economic slowdown that preceded and in some ways precipitated the war in Ukraine. Right? So all of these factors are added together. But then people start drawing conclusions like, oh, but the oligarchs are going to coalesce and overthrow Putin, or the people will come out in the streets and protest. And there's no basis for making those leaps. There are no oligarchs. They haven't been around in about 15 years since Putin came to power, and he basically offered the oligarchs a deal, which is you give up all of your political power and some of your financial power in exchange for keeping most of your wealth. The ones who didn't accept it went into exile or went to prison. And the ones who accepted it forfeited political agency 15 years ago. They don't remember what it smells like anymore. And as for people coming out to protest, there are a lot of things that would be required for that. And the biggest thing is communication. And part of the weirdness of what's happening in Russia economically right now, and I really find this fascinating, is that you don't see panic, you don't see bank runs, you don't see the really sort of the snowball effect of the kind of slowdown of the economy that it would have in a normal country that had free media and open lines of communication. Because the psychological component of an economic disaster hasn't kicked in. Because people don't actually know what's happening economically except from sort of fragmented information that they get because, say, they quit their job and suddenly they realize, oh, there's no job market anymore. But if they haven't quit their job, they may not know this because they don't read about it in the paper. They see that they're spending more money on food than they used to. But again, they're not reading in the paper about the percentages, the double-digit ruble inflation of the last year. A bunch of people on that side.
This way? Oh, yes. If I could just zigzag for a second back to the very particular of the book that the brothers. You mentioned the FBI will never know what exact role they had. Is there any possibility that it could be illuminated by Jahar? Does he know anything, do you think?
At this point, there is very little chance that he could be a reliable witness. First of all, we don't know how much he knew. I'm sorry?
No, I guess that's my question exactly. What your perception would be, it's a little bit ambiguous in the book. I guess you haven't talked to him, so you don't really know. I guess,
right.
As you would say in the book, he's sort of an enigmatic figure, right? But
he is, and the U.S. law enforcement system has done everything in its power to keep him an enigmatic figure. He has been kept under SAMs, the special administrative measures, for most of the time that he's been incarcerated. Special administrative measures, if you haven't heard of them, are measures that are used in the cases of most people who are convicted of terrorism-related crimes in this country, and a few people who are awaiting trial on terrorism-related crimes. So SAMs were put into place in Jahar's case about 2 months into his incarceration. Now, SAMs are a little bit like Fight Club. The first rule of SAMs is you don't talk about SAMs. So normally it's very difficult to find out what somebody's particular SAMs are. But because Jahar's lawyers tried to get SAMs overturned in his case, we have a surprising amount of detail. So in his case, it's like super solitary. He can have absolutely no contact with other inmates, in addition to being in solitary. But he also cannot, he can only have visits from immediate family. The conversations that he has with these people who visit him have to take place, have to be conducted through glass, and they have to be conducted in English, because there's an FBI agent sitting in, listening to what is said. Telephone conversations have to be conducted in English, and he only gets 1 phone call a week with an immediate family member. Correspondence, 1 letter a week, 3 single-sided sheets of paper to an immediate family member. That's all he can have. So the only communication that he has had with any physical contact the only actual sort of human communication he has had over the last 2 years has been with his lawyers. And those of you who read his apology given in court last Wednesday may have noticed that he mentions that he's had quality communication with his lawyers and he wants to thank them for it. It's been clearly been a lifeline for him. But one of the reasons that given for imposing SAMs on him was that he was engaging in a lot of correspondence with a lot of young people. And the implication in this letter by Eric Holder seemed to be that that he was building a fan base. Remember that idea that there were all these Jahar fangirls? But of course, there's another possibility, which is that he could have communicated something to other people, including journalists, or not necessarily journalists, about what he knew or what he thought about the events that preceded the bombings and about his own brother. At this point, the chances of getting any information out of him post-sentencing are next to none.
Do you find convincing the defense argument that the younger brother was dominated by the older brother, especially in the context of Chechen culture?
That he was what, I'm sorry?
Dominated.
Dominated? Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, the younger brother is, by definition, in Chechen culture, dominated by the older brother. The older brother in a Chechen family is the boss. And while I was actually researching this book, there's this wonderful woman who does, she founded an organization for Chechen refugees in this country, which is how I was talking to her. But she also runs a number of feminist projects in the North Caucasus. And she was complaining to me that when women, grown women, are invited to attend these feminist conferences, they have to ask their older brother's permission. And she was just outraged. These are feminist conferences, and they have to ask their brother's permission. So it's standard in a Chechen family to be what you in this country would call dominated. Now, the argument that the defense made that he was brainwashed by his brother, well, it's as shaky as the very concept of brainwashing. The argument that the defense made that the crime wouldn't have occurred without the older brother, that's almost certainly true. I mean, I think in that sense, it's actually sort of a classic pairing of older brother, younger brother is the mastermind. But where I think the defense made not quite credible claims was when they talked about Jahar's system of beliefs. It's very clearly his own. And very clearly, again, if you saw his apology last week, or read the text that was published in a number of places, it's very clear that his religiousness is his own, and he owns it fully. And I think his radical beliefs were his own, but they probably wouldn't have led to violence without the older brother.
In a piece, I think it was a week ago, following the massacre in Charleston, you wrote, I believe it was a blog post for Reuters, in which you said that we shouldn't call Dylan Roof terrorist, and that maybe we shouldn't be calling it a terrorist attack. And I'm wondering if you could expand upon those ideas and your thoughts on the word terrorism and terrorism as an idea. Have we just beaten it into the ground? Does it have any value legally? Did it have any value legally? Just wondering if you could expand on that.
Thank you. I'm so glad you read that. First of all, there's no single definition of terrorism. Most people who are in terrorism studies agree on a few basic things, which is that a terrorist is a non-state actor who targets civilians who are not direct targets but indirect targets, and tries to maximize sort of violence and fear and spread terror in order to advance a political agenda or draw attention to a political message. Right? And that's actually reflected in part of the FBI's definition of terrorism, which is almost a coincidence because there's very little that terrorism studies people in the FBI actually agree on. And in that sense, it's obvious that Dylan Roof fits that basic definition of what a terrorist is. So my argument is that we're not debating the accuracy of the term here, right? We're debating the pragmatic uses of the term. And it basically has three uses. One is legal, one is extra-constitutional, and one is rhetorical. And so the legal use of the term, some people have argued that that's really essential to take the Dylann Roof case out of the South Carolina jurisdiction and punish him more harshly. I don't understand what could be more harsh than the death penalty that the South Carolina governor has already called for. But in fact, the use of the word terrorism in the legal system, in the federal legal system, results in automatic harsher sentencing, right? So if you commit the same act in a non-terrorism related crime, the sentencing grade that is given in the federal system is lower than if you get the terrorism markup, right? So in the book, I talk about these college kids who were convicted of obstructing justice or lying to prosecutors, and they were facing these unbelievable sentences of up to 27 years because of the terrorism markup. So my argument, obviously, is that this is not a great thing, right? To have these ridiculous sentences, especially considering the practice of entrapping people, who, as one federal judge in Manhattan said of a particular case, was that the FBI created a terrorist out of a man whose buffoonery is truly Shakespearean in scope. And who basically was only guilty of greed and stupidity. And then gave him a mandatory 25-year sentence because it was an act of terror, an attempted act of terrorism. So the second use of the word terrorist is extra-constitutional, so it's wiretapping, phone tapping, torture. My argument is that those are not great things either, and they wouldn't be particularly useful in the South Carolina context. At least at this point, nobody's arguing that there is a vast conspiracy to be uncovered through the use of extra-constitutional means in South Carolina, right? So then we end up with the rhetorical use of the word terrorist, which is the most interesting part of the conversation. And I think that the way it's been used in this country since 9/11 is basically to other the perpetrator. It's very much war rhetoric, and as an old war reporter, I see the signs very quickly. It's when you talk about the enemy in war, you have to portray somebody who's both more than human and less than human, right? So more than human in the sense that that person has superhuman powers. And for example, when Tamerlan Tsarnaev was brought into Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, after he had been shot and run over by his brother driving an SUV and dragged about 30 feet. So he had burns, he had gunshot wounds, he had his guts were spilling out. The first thing that the doctors at Beth Israel did before intubating him was check him for radiation, as though he were a human nuclear weapon. And when I asked about this, I was told this is a rarely used protocol, but we thought it was appropriate in this case. Well, of course they thought it was appropriate in this case, because they imagine someone who's been labeled a terrorist to be something that in itself presents inherent danger. He could be radioactive. And at the same time, and this was very clear during Jahar's trial, they're less than human. The people that we call terrorists are less than human, and they're monsters. And that's very much the prosecution's line in that trial, was they were constantly saying, he's a monster because he's a terrorist. These things seem to have an equal sign between them. And again, I'm not even arguing about the accuracy of that. I just think it's not useful because the war on terror is not working, and it hasn't worked. It was never going to work. And the only way to deal with terrorism is to understand where it comes from. And the only way to understand where it comes from is to look at terrorists as people, which is what I try to do in this book.
Unfortunately, I think we only have time for one more question, you've got your hand up, so you're the lucky man.
Masha, first of all, I want to congratulate you on your book and on you being a successful American journalist. And also, I must say that in some ways my life coincides with yours. And I would never have come here had I known what I would encounter here. There is not much difference. It's, how do you say it? 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. So we have capital punishment in the United States. We have the highest number of prisoners. And we have also a lot of income inequality. When you come to DC, what you see first? Homeless. Now I consider homelessness is part of American way of life. And also, I encountered terrible experience with American healthcare. So my mother is now not here. She's in a better world, hopefully. But she was beaten at this hospital, which is not far from here, Washington Hospital Center. It's, uphill. And also, she died under very bad circumstances. She was like a magnet. She attracted all the worst in American healthcare. And it's still dragging on. I'm hoping to get some information about the hospital which investigated itself and found no deficiencies. So I have to do it through freedom of information. We went to this office. It's in a suburb of Baltimore. It's like CIA, like a fortress. And finally, the director or deputy director, he was very much apologetic, and he said, I'll try to get it for you. So, and they have Guantanamo, so it doesn't jive with those high notions of freedom and whatever, and this surveillance, and Snowden is in Moscow. He is not in Washington. And when I was in Rome, I found more freedom in Rome than in Washington, D.C. You can do blah, blah, blah. Here they are all tight-lipped. And you should be politically correct. So I'm glad you are on good terms with New York Times, which I find interesting because they report the best foreign news. Other than that, they're just whining and whatever is, the main thing is unknown. Washington Post is sold to Amazon. It was basically a bankrupt newspaper. Baltimore Sun is a joke, very little to read. So New York Post, Daily News, nothing to read there. So I can't say much about freedom of speech and whatever. God bless you, do your thing, and it was enjoyable to be here.
Well, thank you, and I'm really sorry about the experience you've had here, but yeah. For the record, I'd like to say that I don't think that these countries are comparable or the same. I think that there are a lot of problems in this country, and when I told my daughter, who was 11 at the time, that we were going to have to leave the country, we were going to have to leave Russia, the first question she asked me was, but wait a second, what are we going to do there? Because she was so politically active in Russia, she was active in the protest culture. And I said, well, I knew you would ask that question, so I have some ideas for you. For example, capital punishment. She said, what, it's still legal in the States? And she was fine. She knew she would have her work cut out for her. So that's my best hope, because I have to say, I've been so disheartened over the last few days where I was just watching my Facebook feed and watching the media outlets that I usually read celebrate the Obamacare decision, celebrate the same-sex marriage decision, and pay virtually no attention to the absolutely horrifying Supreme Court decision on capital punishment. Yeah. So I think we can end on that.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. There are copies of the books here. Masha will be happy to sign them. And I do recommend her previous books, especially Man Without a Face, which is about Vladimir Putin. If you haven't read it, it is a must-read. Words Will Break Cement, which is her great book on Pussy Riot, which also, of course, deals with the Putin era. And we will be sure to get Masha back for her next book, I hope. But thank you all so much for coming.